now before we get into the questions, could you provide an introduction about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Helen Li, and I am currently based in Los Angeles. I am a freelance journalist who has written about and reported about technology to culture to business, wide range of topics. And I guess in this case of this podcast, I did an interview with an author, which was not common. That was like my first one. So glad to be
Well,
here.
thank you so much. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me today. And I can't wait to get started with our questions. So, first things first, in your article, you know how Yellowface draws from real literary scandals. Could you explain the controversies surrounding American Dirt and Bad Art Friend, which you referenced, and how they inform the novel's critique?
Yeah, so I can do a rehash of Bad Art Friend. I actually, through the process of prepping for this interview, I reread the New York Times article. I think in summary, the question that in the publishing world, in the writing world, in the creative world, that Bad Art Friend poses, it's from a New York Times Magazine article about two seemingly writer friends that got into a really public and heated lawsuit over copyright, and specifically one of the writers had donated a kidney and posted about her experience, how hopeful she was for the recipient to get the kidney, all of those feelings. And then on this Facebook group that was full of other writers, and then this other writer later published a short story that talked about kidney donations and also an added element of racial dynamics and white saviorism. And the lawsuit essentially going back and forth was one writer was saying, "You took my words, and you copied them, and you draw from my experiences and then kind of profit off of them." And then the other writer is um, kind of asserting that, if we're all writers and we draw inspiration from many things in life. And so essentially the question that it poses, and also Yellowface poses, is when so much of art is drawn from our real life experiences, whether it's ourselves or other people, at what point is it our work, or is it us stealing or drawing inspiration from? What are the boundaries of that when we are creating art and things like that? And so I think Yellowface, how much in your podcast do you divulge to your listeners about what happens in the book, by the way?
I kind of assumed that they already read it, but please like
Amazing.
expand on
Okay.
it. Yeah, just like
Okay,
a little bit.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I didn't want to, because sometimes, when you do book reviews, when you do, you don't reveal endings because then nobody's going to read the book. Um,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
essentially, in Yellowface, the premise is you don't need to know the ending to know the premise, but the premise is this girl named Juniper and her so-called best friend Athena. One night they're having pancakes. Athena's Chinese American, Juniper is white, and Athena chokes on a pancake piece and dies. But Juniper, her friend, sees this manuscript on her desk, and it's about the Chinese Labor Corps, these volunteer soldiers in World War One who were Chinese, little known history, and kind of a historical fiction. And she takes that manuscript, she packages it up, edits it, submits it to her editor, and publishes it. It's a big success. And so, in the process of this, though, after she publishes, there's a lot of backlash about, like, did she steal someone's work? You know, what is this white woman doing? Trying to, write about this specific topic. And I think a lot of the critiques are similar in that it's essentially, you know, and another element before I want to go back, Athena, the
Mhm.
girl who has passed away, who's Chinese American, she also is a very privileged Chinese American. And a lot of her work, when she was alive and as a writer, was also in some ways borrowing or stealing from the people around her as well.
Mhm.
And so their
Yeah.
relationship, for instance, as a friendship, Juniper underwent some trauma in college, and Athena had stolen from that for one of her short stories. So
Mhm.
Yellowface and Bad Art Friend kind of examine this dynamic of writers and peers in the publishing world, and what is borrowing, what is stealing, and what is drawing inspiration from. And Yellowface kind of takes it to an extreme in that literally she takes the manuscript and
Mhm.
literally passes off some of, or almost all of the research as her own, when she did in
Yeah,
fact not do any of it.
absolutely. I think Yellowface is like an extreme that you can go, and it's definitely like fictional in a sense that maybe no one in the real world is willing to go that far. But at the same time, there might be people out there, but whose stories like we just simply don't know. So it's a possibility for sure.
Yeah. And I think some of it, I don't know, I thought Yellowface actually forces forces you to reflect, at least for me, there were some times where I almost could see why Juniper felt the way she did. And then it made me question a lot of things in my own life. I was like, okay, what does it say about me if I like can feel this like sympathy towards her and some of what she
Hmm.
feels? And then it's kind of like the don't hate the player, hate the game instance where um, maybe we're really hating on Juniper as a character, but what we should really be critically examining is the publishing industry itself and how it tokenizes people, how it profits, and how it forces people to kind of maybe go through these crazy thoughts of like, this is the only thing I can publish, and all of that stuff. So, but hopefully, I answered your question there.
No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for such an elaborate answer. I love that. And I have a follow-up question to that. So, how do
Yeah.
you think R.F. Kuang's novel engages with questions of who gets to tell certain stories and the ethics of borrowing from real life, even though we touched on it a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Um, I think the question of who gets to tell stories is, I mean, you have to have access to the publishing world. um,
Hmm.
and you have to kind of be the darling. And so even Athena, when she did have access, she was like a prodigy, Asian American writer prodigy in this book. But even when she did have access later on, it's revealed that they wouldn't let her go beyond publishing about trauma, publishing about her heritage, publishing historical fiction. And it sort of limited her to, um, even if she got access, there was a ceiling to her storytelling. Um, and the ironic thing that this book also explores is Juniper starts to feel like her herself as a white woman. The publishing world doesn't want her stories. They're not palatable enough or marketable enough. Even though historically speaking, like in her personal anger about everything as a writer and trying to find success, she kind of overlooks or just blatantly chooses to overlook the fact that historically publishing access has been for mostly men. Like we think about, was it oh my gosh, who wrote Frankenstein? But it was like a woman who a lot of, and even like R.F. Kuang herself choosing to publish with R.F. is, her real name is Rebecca. So
Hmm.
choosing to go with a gender neutral name, it reflects the historical axis of publishing being mostly men, mostly white men in the West. And it's only in recent years where this like abundance of diversity for more different kinds of stories, different life experiences has come up. But we see Juniper as a writer. You can understand all of this, and being a writer, you can still feel anger because you're also just trying to struggle in the world and trying to make it. Um,
Hmm.
and so I think kind of R.F. Kuang, when she wrote this book, she's illustrating the structural challenges of being a published author, right? But also, just as a selfish individual standpoint, like getting access is already hard in itself. Like even when
Hmm.
Juniper makes it, she has to keep churning that wheel. And so even when you have access, not like the easiest thing or the most happiest thing afterwards. It's kind of, you're expected to kind of be in this capitalist machine and keep churning out things and maybe traumatic things.
Hmm.
And it's kind of this desire for trauma to sell that kind of pushes maybe Athena and Juniper to kind of purge stories from other people because it sells. So I think that's the commentary that she's making.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree. I think it's so unique the way that she like conveys that message without explicitly stating it, but like she interweaves it within her story. All right, next. Moving a little bit away from the topic of the book, What drew you to cover Yellowface for the LA Times, and what was your initial reaction to the novel?
Yeah, so I proposed covering this book and the author because I was scrolling on TikTok and people get advanced reader copies or ARCs in the publishing
Hmm.
world. For instance, right now we're recording this podcast. R.F. Kuang already has another book
Yes.
coming out in August, and people are getting
Uh-huh.
Calabasas copies and reviewing. And they do this now because publishers want it to be leaked so that one, they can, drum up the PR, there's demand for it. And then two, like shape the marketing based upon kind of what people's reactions are. And so,
Hmm.
although I'm not in the publishing world, this is just what I would guess it to be. So I
Hmm.
really covered it because I saw it on TikTok and I thought the premise was so interesting. And the way that it was marketed to me from people who read it on TikTok was, you're going to be so angry at this protagonist. You're going to read it and you're going to hate her so much because the premise is wild. Like, how dare she, literally yellow face herself and, um, you know, steal this person's work. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, I was really curious because the premise was so wild. And so then I pitched it to the books editor at the LA Times, and then I reached out to HarperCollins, and they sent me a copy, and then I had to read it, and I reached out to their PR team to get in touch with RF Kuang, and then we did the interview. So that's pretty much how the process went. It was really from my curiosity of why so many people on TikTok hated Juniper as a
Hmm.
character, um, and wanting to find out for myself, just because just it, great title choice. Yellowface is a very uh like, you don't think it could happen today kind of thought pops into your head. So to put it
Hmm.
as a title is really eye catching. And also this cover, I mean, like, look at that. Like,
Yeah, it's really
it's yellow
iconic.
with two eyes. It's really iconic. And I think in the UK version, what's even more shocking, actually no,
Hmm.
this version is the cover is yellow, but the inside cover is white. So it's even more significant in
Oh,
that sense. That she's literally like white with yellow skin as a
wow.
book. So, but that's me speculating, thanks to TikTok. So,
Mhm. Yes. Well, while writing your article, did your perspective on the publishing industry or literary scandals shift in any way? Or like, did you learn anything surprising or new?
yeah, I think there's writing the article, but there's also reading the book, and I think those go hand in hand. And so, reading the book, I think what really surprised me was how nuanced R.F. Kuang covered the. There's like people of color, Asian American, white, that dynamic, and the publishing
Hmm.
industry. But also, she covers even within the Asian American writing world and publishing world how there's actually not a uniform voice. There's actually critique of each other consistently.
Hmm.
Um, and, for instance, Athena being quite a privileged person, Arf Kwong herself, from my understanding, also went to like quite a privileged background. And
Hmm.
reading the little like Twitter battles and when Twitter was still very much lively, um, all of those nuances were things like I remember being among my friends and reading other Asian American authors because there's been an explosive growth. You do have more room now to critique people's writing, um, and I think that was what I learned a lot more is there's a lot of writers who actually critique each other and they're very valid, but you may not hear about them because publishing houses for a bit had, one token diverse author. And so that was the only thing you could and for instance, when I was in college, um, we had an Asian American literature class and uh, actually no, not college. College was a bit more nuanced, but in high school, we had
Oh,
to learn
wow.
about world literatures, and
Hmm.
we had to read
Yes.
Maxine King Hong. What is that? Did I get her name wrong? Maxine. Oh my God, Hong Kingston. Um, like I think Woman Warrior or some short piece that she wrote, and I remember reading it and feeling like, wow, this is really powerful, but I can't identify with this at all
Hmm.
in some ways. But because our English teacher would talk about like, what is it like being a Chinese woman, whatever. And then you start if you're a minority growing up where I grew up, which was in Virginia, Central Virginia, you're going to start adapting those narratives and like fall into saying like that trauma is like also what I experience and kind of adapt people's stories. If there's not enough representation, you're going to adapt what there is. I believe that's also what can be sold. I'm
Mhm.
rambling at this point. Sorry for your question.
No, no.
I think your question was focusing on what did you learn about publishing world and about
Yeah.
yourself. I think another big thing I learned was it gave me a chance to reflect on the beginning of my journalism career, in which
Hmm.
I didn't go to journalism school, or really it was after I graduated college, like a couple years out, that I decided to try it. But when I first started, there were moments where I thought I had to like I have nothing to sell to you because I have no clips. So what I can sell when I pitch a story is like, as a Chinese American woman, this is my take on the news, and I have this authority to report on these stories. That was around the time of the Atlanta spa shootings. That was around the time of like 2020, 2021, kind of like a lot of the reckoning. And so I remember pigeonholing myself too, because I thought that's my way to get in, and that's frankly kind of sad because I have a lot more to offer than that, right? But at the time, that's kind of how I felt. And so I can see why Athena either has to keep writing the same stories, or
Hmm.
Juniper doesn't feel like her stories are valid enough because of
Yeah.
what the market is, or things like that. I hope all of that makes sense.
No, yeah,
But
totally. So, but you mentioned earlier in high school when you read those books,
hmm
you didn't really resonate. But with
hmm
Yellowface, with Juniper and Athena's stories, did you resonate with that while you were reading it? Did
hmm
that make you feel
yeah.
like the way that you
Yeah.
talked about?
Yeah. I mean, it resonated because a lot of the questions about authorship, about um who has a lot of the questions that Juniper asks, they kind of seem offensive, but also I've asked them myself too.
Hmm.
Um and when I think about it, it's basically some of the stuff that she writes in this book. You're like, this is so ridiculous. Like a lot of like these Asian American authors like critiquing um Juniper, but at the same time, those are very valid criticisms, and those happen in real life. And then you're seeing Juniper's reaction, like, oh man, like if I'm in her situation, I also would feel like sort of attacked, because I also, put in some work that she believes like edited the book itself before it published. um and I asked RF Kwon the question. uh I remember that was the most uncomfortable question for me to ask her when I did the author interview, was like, I read the book, and sometimes Juniper says things, and I shouldn't be empathizing or sympathizing with this character because of what evil things she did. But I find myself
Hmm.
being like, yeah, I have the same questions. Like, I feel sometimes her anger and exasperations because she's in this cage of the publishing world. And then Arv Kwong said, well, yeah, that's why you write a book, right? Like that if you write a complex villain and you identify that with that villain, we learn more about humanity in the process. And so, um, yeah, that's how I kind of felt while reading the book. Was I was like, man, Juniper's like kind of an asshole, and like some of her thoughts, but also some of what she's thinking, like, yeah, very valid. Like,
Hmm.
does Athena know any more about like Chinese labor core suffering than another person? Because Athena is also someone who dug into like this idea of being Chinese American, and was like she dug into the idea that trauma sells, and she would sell the trauma that wasn't hers.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, my answer is a complete word vomit. Sorry about that.
No,
I'm
no,
like almost thinking out loud. Happy to re-record an answer later if you
no,
find it
no,
to be
no.
more worthwhile.
We're good. I
Yeah.
love the authenticity and like how it's just like real, I would love to keep it. I want to keep it.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, but yeah, I think totally RF Kwong just I sometimes wonder if she took like psych classes that's like at another level, because the way that the audience, the readers think is exactly maybe like what she wanted. And it's crazy because like every individual thinks differently, but rereading
Hmm.
this book, I feel like everyone is able to sympathize in a way, which is crazy.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it comes from like Arf Kwong, when I talked to her, she also said like her writer friends are super kind and they're all very like amicable and like it's a great community. But I'm sure given, she writes a lot of books and being in the publishing industry, she hears stories. And so when you write some of those things and draw from them as inspiration into a book, you're bound to hit some people's heartstrings because
Hmm.
it's not like they're made up out of nowhere. These are complaints, it's a competitive world and these are people's feelings that have already been felt. And so
Hmm.
um, you're supposed to feel for Juniper, even though you might hate her at the
Yeah,
same time.
yeah. That's a perfect transition to our next question, which is, do you think this novel is more focused on critiquing racial dynamics in the publishing world, or does it present a broader critique of the industry's ethical issues instead?
I think one can't exist without the other, right? I think one of the broader issues she's critiquing is from a racial dynamic standpoint. Like, she's critiquing, yes, the way that we have remedied structural racism is to start tokenizing people. And then how productive is that? Not very productive,
Hmm.
as exhibited by the fact that, Athena couldn't publish outside of what she wanted to. People like Candace felt shunned and so those are some dynamics that exist within publishing and pitching circles. I'm not part of those. I've not yet tried to pitch a book.
Hmm.
But I have been in some publications. I have been at meetings, or not meetings. I have had stories. I pitched, uh, like, you pitch a lot of ideas and they aren't successful. But I do remember pitching an idea once and then an editor saying, well, it was during Pride Month and I was pitching along those lines. And I do remember an editor saying like, oh, we're in, you know, the business section already has a Pride Month story. And so then when you have that, then I guess you can't pitch a second one because somebody on the team um, is already taking that on. So yeah, so I think there is a criticism of the publishing world at large, but you can't separate that from kind of the racial reckoning that publishing or the creative industries have had um, for the past couple of years. And so I don't think like it's either or situation with Arquan critiquing racial dynamics for the publishing world at large. I think there are a lot of racial tensions within the publishing worlds. I think there will often be
Hmm.
tensions in places where limited resources exist. So, yeah, hopefully that answers your
Yeah,
question. I don't think it's an either or. I think she's doing many levels of critique. And if she
right.
were to be here as an author, she'd say, that's up to your interpretation.
For sure. And since covering this book, have you noticed any new publishing controversies that echo Kwan's critiques, especially in how like online conversations today shape scandals? And has the book influenced these discussions? And if so, how?
Hmm. Within the book publishing world, I don't follow it as closely. Um, I'm thinking about at least in the movie world where at least now because there's more films coming out about like because there's not just one Asian American film coming out anymore, or just one film with an Asian story. We can have more stories, and it's led kind of a reinterpretation of movies like Crazy Rich Asians and kind of some of their portrayals of like Southeast Asian racial dynamics. And um, yeah, I think I can't answer that question about the publishing world, but I do think that a lot of questions um Sorry, actually, I just thought of something. This is not the
No
publishing world.
worries.
I apologize. This is not the publishing world. But something that I just thought about that is not necessarily the publishing world, but it also
Hmm.
these questions are coming up is in the age of influencers, in the age of AI, who is the author and who gets to profit? Those are questions that are still coming up. I highly recommend
Hmm.
people read. There's this piece by Mia Sato. She writes for The Verge, and she wrote about these two Amazon influencers having similar beige aesthetics and one
Hmm.
suing the other for copying her aesthetic. But can you copy aesthetics if like that's what the company pushes upon you? And
Mm.
so I think
Yeah.
that's not per se publishing, but it goes around the question of like copyright and ownership. Can you own an aesthetic, and uh, can that be the only thing you specialize in when everybody's sharing it around? I think those are questions that will continue as technology like AI comes out too, where people are mimicking each other, but not necessarily with consent
Hmm.
or yeah, things like that. Sorry, that is a mess of an answer. Feel free to cut that section.
No, no worries. Absolutely. I think sometimes these stories are so ironic, it makes you think twice. But then I feel like when you're in the situation yourself, you think like this cannot be happening to me right now. Like this is actually really, really serious. So there's always two sides to it, obviously.
Hmm.
But like you mentioned earlier about the how this book is probably like based on real stories, do you think these controversies make the book more powerful, or does it actually make it more controversial?
No, I think being the most specific you can in this book, when I read the little Twitter battle featured in Yellowface, I was like, yes, this is how Twitter canceling would work. And yes, this is the way the internet probably would work. And I I don't know. I think some of the stories that obviously not everything would happen to a single person. This is like kind of a stretch. I feel like Juniper goes through everything, every imaginable,
Mm-hmm.
like prior to the publishing process, right? But
Mm-hmm.
Arv Kwong probably does this, and again, I'm just assuming. I spoke with her once, so take my words with a grain of salt. But I think a lot of what happens with Juniper is because, from the manuscript turning in process to the marketing process to the book talks, her even teaching at the Asian American Writers Workshop, which is such a niche thing that, like, it's to show how writers make a living, and it's to show specifically how Asian American writers have had to make a living, and then Juniper here comes along with the racially ambiguous quote last name, which is her middle name, and has to do all of this stuff. And I think being so specific, even the references to the DC Chinatown, which if you know your Chinatowns, I would argue DC Chinatown is the most. I respect all Chinatowns, but it's compared to Boston Chinatown, SF Chinatown, even Philly Chinatown. DC Chinatown is kind of like an image, like a performative image of what
Mm.
some some things are. I don't know if you've been around there, but I think oh man, maybe I'm misremembering books. I think Juniper goes down there and like does quote research at one point. Maybe I'm wrong. Feel free to correct me. I might be getting two books mixed up.
No, I think maybe.
Okay. But
Yeah.
going back on track, some of the specificity that R. Kuang has in this book is really to reflect on some of these interracial um, tensions and kind of the dialogue in between. Um, and I don't think it's controversial. I think putting it in there is reflective of what a lot of people feel, and being really specific with all of these references from uh, the workshops that Juniper goes to, from even like the Chinese American community in Maryland. All of the or all of that is to paint a real impact of what Juniper's doing and how that's going to hurt people, because I mean, she thinks it's just for her publishing sake and to, become a writer, but her in the process of what she's doing, she is hurting a lot of people. So being specific is not controversial to show real life hurt that people can
Yes,
make with unintentional decisions.
I agree. And I think that like more being more specific also makes it easier for readers to like sympathize with your story because it's actually like real. Our next question is, what was your experience with the article and also the book? But I know we touched upon it a lot throughout our interview. So if you could sum it up, like what would you say is the
Mhm.
big takeaway?
Yeah. So I think the big takeaway is when I pitched covering this book, it was like I was shocked when the book's editor said, "Oh, I'm surprised we don't have anyone covering this yet." Because on TikTok, it was like it was kind of R.F. Kuang's book after her previous book, Babel and Poppy Wars trilogy. She's like a big author, so her book coming out, it was kind of the editor was like, "Oh, I'm surprised we don't have anyone covering it." And then I pitched it, and I pitched myself too as a person reading the book and interviewing her. I think the big conclusion I got was if you think something deserves coverage, find the
Hmm.
right person to pitch your idea and make it happen. Because I had never interviewed a book author before and didn't know how it worked. I didn't even know you got sent a copy of the book, which makes sense because you got to read it before you interview the author. Um, and yeah, there's the article itself is just a couple of questions and her answers, but like
Hmm.
all pieces in books or in journalism, a lot of it your editor has to go through and fine tune and give something you can read. So there's probably a lot of stuff that was on the cutting room, you know, and didn't make it in there. All in all, kind of pitch if you believe it deserves coverage. Um, that's the lesson I learned.
I like that. Take a step, just a brave step,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Nice. And after analyzing Yellowface and the conversation around it, what do you hope readers take away from both the book and your article?
Mm. I mean, my article wasn't that in depth. I wrote like an introduction and kind of how I thought about the book as a reader, and then I had some questions and our Kwang's answers. So it's quite short actually, and so not super in depth. I highly encourage other people to read profiles of her. I think probably the New York Times did one, um, and uh, and just read and glean for yourself. Um, I do think what's great about Q&As from a takeaway standpoint is they're the exact words the author said. So they're not kind of structured in an article where uh, you get kind of straight what their thoughts are.
Hmm.
Um, I think, gosh, I think the biggest takeaway from the piece is that if you read the Q&A, I think you can tell that R. Kwong herself is it's like a really meta layer. She's like promoting this book that's about this author who stole from another person's work. And so she's satirizing her own publishing world too. And so, sorry, I might have lost your question throughout there. Do you mind repeating the last part of it?
Oh yeah, like what do you hope readers take away from the book and also your article?
I think if there's one thing you should take away from the article while reading R.F. Kuang's thoughts and the book is to, it sounds so cheesy, but read the book yourself and judge for yourself. Because I have talked about this book with some of my friends, and some of them are like, "Oh, I hate like Juniper," and then other people read it and they're like, actually the ending was so fast, and I don't know, Candace as a character, like there's so many different critiques of the way the book is structured, the way that Juniper is as a person, um and we all will have our own thoughts and conclusions. And just like how TikTok inspired me to read this book, because I was like, why is everybody hating on this main protagonist? I read the book and I got to make my own conclusions and judgment, and it led to a lot of reflections about the questions um, about who gets to, have a voice in the publishing world. And I really appreciated that process throughout the book,
Hmm.
reading it. So my takeaway is read the book yourself, define your own critiques, and use it as a springboard to learn more about the book publishing world, the journalism world, and yeah, don't just take someone's word for it. This is not one of those if people still use Spark Notes or AI, whatnot these days, this is a book that is a quick read. Read it yourself, make your own judgment calls. Um, yeah, because because I came to a surprising conclusion while reading it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that last part was really powerful and important, especially to our
Mm-hmm.
Gen Z society, because we tend to rely on those a lot these days. But
The summaries.
yes, but it's
Yeah.
important to preserve your
Yeah.
own voice too. That was actually the last question for our interview. But thank you so much for all of your insightful answers. I really enjoyed learning about your like takeaways, your insights, all of it. They're
Mhm.
really interesting.
Well, thank you
That
so much,
sounds good.
Amber. Let me know if there's anything else
Yes,
you need from me. And happy to provide. And again, thanks for reaching out.
sounds good. Thank you so much.